Hello and welcome to Spread Book Joy. Today I'm going to talk to you about how you can help if your child is not enjoying reading or is struggling to read. If you're new to the channel, I'm Jack. I'm a qualified primary school teacher who recommends great books for home or school. I've got some wonderful videos, review videos. One of my latest ones is on this fantastic book, Amari and the Night Brothers, which I'll link in the description box below. So do you know, or do you have a child who is about 8 or 9 years old, who can read functionally but chooses not to, who's not quite fluent completely yet and really struggles to enjoy reading and books? So this is a subject that's close to my heart really, because I spent many years teaching children who had got to the end of primary school, who were like 9, 10, 11 years old, and they didn't seem to have any trouble picking up sort of decoding and functional reading, but for whatever reason they'd slowed right down. They were choosing not to read at home in the evenings and were having real issues with comprehension, with getting any further in their reading. And they weren't children who had issues beginning reading. There were children who were keeping up with their peers up until the ages of about 7 or 8, and then for whatever reason their reading levels just seemed to get further and further behind their peers. Now there are children who have undiagnosed issues. We may find they get to a certain age and they may have an undiagnosed specific learning difficulty such as dyslexia or something like that. So I'm not talking about children like that, because those children need very specialist help. So the children I'm talking about, they find reading a chore. You have to persuade them to read. They're not quite into the books they bring home. They often will bring back books that are too easy for them because they don't want to push themselves. They find it really boring, and actually you could give them something a bit more difficult and they'll read it out to you, but when you ask them questions about it, they don't necessarily know what they've read. So those sorts of children. The only way you get better at reading is to read every day, and you need to read for at least, we tell the children to read for at least 20 minutes a day in the beginning, or 20 minutes to half an hour a day. And if they're not reading for that every single day and they're getting further and further behind, by the time you sort of catch on to this at sort of the ages of 8, 9, it's not too late. You can hook them back in, but you need to put some love and care and attention and effort into it, and you need to show them that they'll find a book that they'll love, that reading is worthwhile, and that's what they need to know. So I've got some general tips, and then I've got some more specific recommendations for tried and tested, because don't forget I did this for years and years and years with groups of children who I sent off. My biggest pleasure in life was sending those children off to secondary school, being able to really read and enjoying reading. Now, one thing I would say is there's no blame here when it comes to these sort of children. It's not down to the school, it's not down to the home. It's something that school and home need to work on together as a partnership, and there's no blame to be put on anyone. And a lot of the times I would sit down with the parents of these children and we would talk, and those children would be elusive to the parent at home about their reading at school, and they'd be elusive with the teacher. Good communication between home and school is really key. That's the first thing I would suggest that you really need to pay attention to. So the next few tips I'm going to give you on general book selection. Contemporary school story settings are brilliant. So sometimes these children have not got into a specific genre yet, so you're not quite sure what they're going to enjoy. So a contemporary school setting is one that they can all enjoy, because it's something that's familiar to them. Even if it's a school, so say they're in the UK and it's an American school setting, even then those children will be interested in it because it's something that they can relate to, and it's something that they can ground themselves in, and they can navigate quite simply without having to learn rules of a new world, for example, and things like that. Tip number 2, humour is always appreciated. So if you're a bit squeamish about slang in books or toilet humour, get over it. And those things aren't aimed at you as an adult reader, they're aimed at those children. So you just have to get over it, get over any squeamishness around things like that, and really go with it. Humour is a great winner. So tip number 3 is, again, kind of related to the last tip, is don't be a book snob. If you're thinking this isn't good enough, this isn't good children's literature, it's trite, it's formulaic, There's no such thing as a bad children's book if it's getting them to read. The aim of a children's book is to get the child to engage with it. So trite and formulaic is really good for emerging readers because their understanding of narrative structure is not sophisticated yet. Trite and formulaic stuff is what they need because it's familiar and it allows them to predict and understand and place themselves in that sort of understand the narrative. And it's really satisfying when they get that similar pattern and they can predict things and things will work out in a satisfying way for them. So don't be a book snob. My next tip is just about that same thing. If they find a series that they like and they start to want every Enid Blyton book, is in my case when I was younger, or they want every Horrid Henry book, or they want every single Goosebumps book, let them do it. There is the Swedish have a term for it called it's the age of book devouring. So there are stages of reading, and that's a stage that they say that's what we're aiming to get children to. If you're a reader yourself, you'll remember it, where you just inhaled these books and you couldn't get enough of them and you just read the same formulaic thing over and over and over again because you loved it, because it spoke to you and it said something to you and it connected with you. And that's what we're aiming for. We want to get them into that stage. So related to that, familiarise yourselves with popular children's series, because if they do get into an age of book devouring, then you want to be able to recommend a series that's got longevity. So I'll talk a bit about book series when I give you some specific tips about things that I think work really, really well. And lastly, short chapters. Books with short chapters keep readers hooked. Think about your own reading. If you're reading a book with shorter chapters, you actually invariably read more because people like the satisfaction of finishing at the end of a chapter. So if you've got a book with short chapters, you might do I'll just read one more chapter. I'll just read one more chapter. Check it out the next time you read a book with short chapters. I guarantee you read them faster. So I've got a few recommendations for different text types. I'm going to go through them quite quickly. I don't want this video to be too long. So first thing I'd like to recommend to you are joke and riddle books. What's really excellent about jokes and riddles is that they're meant to be told out loud. So children who struggle with reading often struggle with expression and intonation. And so practicing with jokes and riddles, getting them to do a stand-up routine, they love that. The Guinness Book of Records and weird fact books. That's my next tip for you. Children love that. I think the Guinness Book of Records is something that I would have in every classroom, and books of the unexplained and things like that. So anything about weird or wonderful facts, like I said, Guinness Book of Records, Ripley Do a Believe It or Not for younger children, I believe, and things like that. Perfect as well. Horrible histories, I'd recommend those. They're really gruesome, they're full of facts, they've got lots of illustrations, so the text is not always big chunks of text that really intimidate struggling readers. You've got a big series there, so it ticks a lot of boxes for struggling reader books. Another amazing series is Tom Gates by the author Liz Pichon, and she is an illustrator who wanted to write the sort of book that would have made her want to pick up books when she was younger. I believe she's dyslexic, or she's written the books with dyslexic children in mind, and she has included tons and tons of lovely illustrations throughout the book, which are really humorous and really funny. Tom is a wonderful character. It's very similar to the Diary of a Wimpy Kid books in the way it looks, but it's a UK based author, and I prefer the series. In my opinion, I prefer it. She's got tons of them. It ticks again. It's a contemporary school setting. It's not huge chunks of text, but it's broken up with illustrations, and there are, I think, about 15 books in the series at last count, so it ticks a lot of those boxes for my previous tips. Next series I'm going to recommend is one that I always push out and I've always had huge success with, is Goosebumps. So R.L. Stein's Goosebumps series is a classic children's series, and I couldn't recommend it highly enough for struggling readers. So the great thing about Goosebumps books is contemporary, a good scare. Children love a good scare. The vocabulary level is no higher than American 5th grade. So the vocabulary is kept, so the children, they don't have to stumble over words like I'm doing right now. I'm trying to explain this to you. The children can carry on reading and they can enjoy the story and they can get through it. Every chapter ends on a cliffhanger. Purposefully, so they want to keep reading one more chapter. They're short chapters too, and they're designed to hook children to read. R.L. Stein actually wrote them because he wanted something that children will keep wanting to carry on reading and find out what happens next. If people are worried a bit about the horror is no one dies in Goosebumps. At least I don't as far as I know, and R.L. Stine himself claims that no one dies in Goosebumps, and there is always a happy ending. The one book he said he did where there was an unhappy ending, he got loads of complaints about and had to write a sequel. So yeah, Goosebumps, brilliant. And you can get really good packs on Amazon and places like that for cheap. You can get them secondhand, and yeah, they're a great series. Really recommend those. Next up is another blast from the past. This is from my childhood. I was a bit old for Goosebumps. When Goosebumps came out, I was already a teenager, in my late teens actually. And these ones though were books which were huge when I was a kid. They were the fighting fantasy series, Choose Your Own Adventure books, by Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone. Now I've got a set that I bought off the internet, and the covers, I remember them from when I was younger and we didn't think anything of them, but I think they're quite inappropriate covers now. But they've been reissued since, because they've started commissioning authors like Charlie Higson. He's been commissioned to do Choose Your Own Adventure books, and I think he's released at least one at last count, and they're fantastic. So if you're not familiar with them, the idea is that there's a setup at the start of the book which is about a chapter long, and then the person who's reading the book has to choose what happens next. And there's a quite complex game you can play with dice, or you can just choose the next page. And the idea is to get to the end of the adventure. Now I used to set up a little lunchtime club, and we would read them together, and we would decide as a group, and we would sort of, you know, take turns in reading the next part, and the children couldn't wait to be the person who came to read the next part, the part they'd all chosen. They're fantastic. They're a game and a book. What more could you ask for? Two more things I'm going to recommend. One is poetry. Poetry is great for children who struggle to read because it can be less intimidating than big blocks and blocks of text. And the best thing about poetry is it's meant to be read out loud. Again, much like the jokes and riddle books, it's something that will allow children to practice their expression and their intonation and perform. I always had real success with Please Mrs. Butler, which is classic children's school poetry over here, and Please Mrs. Butler, and another one which children absolutely adore is a novel written in verse, which I've never read with a child and they've not loved it. And it's by Mallory Blackman, of course, wonderful Mallory Blackman, and it's called Cloud Busting. And it's a novel set in a contemporary school setting, and it's all about a boy called Davy who is taunted and very different from the other children. And the story starts off with the child, I can't remember the child who's narrating it, but they're given an assignment to write a poem in school, and they want to write about Davy, and we find out that something has happened to Davy, and so the story takes us back to see what's happened. And it's really sad. It's a case of bullying, and the children get so engrossed in it, and every single chapter is a poem, and a different type of poem. So you get all sorts of different types of poetry that you can examine and look at. You get shape poems and all sorts of things. It's a book that I've had huge success with, and I'd highly recommend. Last thing I'm going to recommend to you is manga. Manga is the sort of catch-all term for Japanese graphic novels and comic books, with a caveat. I don't know a huge lot about manga. It's one of my reading goals for 2021 to read more manga, and especially middle grade, and get into read some manga that I could recommend to children. Manga, if it's not for younger children, can contain explicit material, sort of violent or sexual content. So you have to be really, really careful, because it can look like it's written for children because of the style of artistic style will be very similar, but content could be quite different. So I would ask booksellers and librarians and people who know about these things. So I'm hoping to get to learn a bit more about it and do some recommendations for it, because it's so popular. So I just want to leave you with a last thought. Remember, they're not reluctant readers, they're struggling readers. If they're reluctant to read, they're struggling for whatever reason. They're struggling to find a book that they engage with, to find a book they enjoy. They may have another issue that's causing them to avoid reading. Hopefully you got some tips that are really useful. If you've got any questions, please pop them in the comments below. If there's anything else you'd like me to expand upon or do another video on, I'm happy to do that. And if you like this video, please click like and subscribe to my channel. I post videos every Saturday, and I do reviews and quick videos, as well as more in-depth videos and things like this. So hopefully I'll see you here again soon. Bye!